So perhaps you could tell us a bit about how you first became interested in ethnomusicology, Dr. Picken.
Well, it happened very, very much by degrees. When I was in my teens, of course, there was no such thing as musicology even, let alone ethnomusicology. I remember a physiologist friend of mine saying that his professor of physiology, A.B. Hill at King's College London, no university, had said that a relative of his was actually studying a subject called musicology in the United States. And we all threw up our hands in horror and laughed heartily. So there was absolutely no possibility of any sort of academic career in the musical field when I was 14, 15, 16. Indeed, when I was coming up to being a scholarship candidate here. And in my family, on my mother's side, of Welsh extraction, which is perhaps significant, I had a redoubtable aunt who could play every stringed instrument that was after a fashion. She also played and taught piano, and I was her pupil. And she lived hand-to-mouth existence, playing in cinemas, picture houses, as we usually called them then. Occasionally I was called in to deputise for her. So I had quite a practical experience of music at a fairly early age. And nobody thought it was a suitable life for a male. And so there was never any question of music being my career. I was quite a reasonable pianist. I could sight read like mad. I often played things best the first time I ever played them. But I gather Thurston Dodd did that as well, so I'm in fairly good company. Anyway, what happened was that I started life as a zoologist. I'd been vaguely drawn to both China and Japan as a child. I remember actually dressing up in various garments of my mother's and pretending I was Japanese, and in the garden with a footstool as a table and this sort of thing. Nothing really happened until when I was doing my first research at the Plymouth Marine Biological Laboratory. There was a young Chinese physiologist, a pupil of this self-same Professor Hill I mentioned before, and I'd taken with me to Plymouth a bilingual text of what we used to call in those days the Book of Odes, the Shijing, the collection of song texts allegedly assembled by Confucius and used, according to tradition, in the instruction of the young nobility. And this wasn't purely a sort of moralizing exercise on the part of Confucius, if indeed he did it, but it was a necessary part of the education of a young nobleman to be able to sing some of these songs, at any rate, at more or less official banquets. And so this was possibly why a collection was put together. And for the very first time, I heard what Chinese really sounds like, because he read some of these to me. And he was so impressed by my interest, which had already come into being in Chinese music, because of course these song texts of the perhaps 7th century BC, some of them perhaps earlier, are full of references to instruments and particular songs and so forth, that he wrote to China and obtained for me a book on Chinese music. And that was the beginning. There were a number of tunes in it, and by then I'd learned a little Chinese, and I could pick my way through it here and there and transcribe the tunes. That was really the beginning, and then nothing happened for years because I became absorbed by my zoological studies. And it wasn't until the war came and I was left intellectually relatively at a loose end that anything else happened. I was, as all young scientists were, I was put into the Central Scientific Register, and a job was found for me as lay officer in charge of the Eastern Regional Blood Transfusion Lab, which was out in Storey's Way, in what had been the entomological field station, and I think is again the entomological field station. And my days were spent in a sterile room, filtering human serum, bottling it. And so, as this stuff came through its filter, I had plenty of opportunity for meditation on this and that. And at the same time, there was a young Chinese writer who had a special fellowship at King's, Xiao Qian, and somehow I was introduced to him. I forget how the contact was established, and it was he who put me in touch with the then professor of Chinese, Gustav Hallam, and I used to go to Hallam along with a young Polish woman, a refugee presumably, for a 2-hour session once a week on what he called elementary grammar. And by the time I got to the end of his elementary grammar course, I had a smattering of Chinese epigraphy, historical phonetics, periodization of Chinese literature. We were expected to use dictionaries in all the Chinese dictionaries in all the European languages. Hallam himself had once been required to have a speaking knowledge of all the 20-odd languages of the Austro-Hungarian Empire during the Great War. And so by the time I got to China, the reason why I went, I'll come to in a moment, I had a fair smattering of this and that. Again, from the Central Register, I was lifted out of that and asked to go and join Joseph Needham, who by then had set himself up in Chongqing in what was called the Sino-British Science Cooperation Office, Zhongying Keshue Hezuguan. And this was a sort of glorified post office for exchange of information and requests of all kinds between the Chinese and people in the UK. He went out as an expert lecturer in special topics in his own field of biochemistry, first of all. And he had discovered the really profound needs of the science teaching departments of universities, many of them evacuated from eastern China into remote districts of western China with not even the most elementary apparatus to teach with, and the fearful consequences of purely textbook training of students. And so he started trying to get the British Council to send out supplies of various kinds. With the Office of Information in Calcutta, they started an actual service of importing simple scientific equipment for class use. In the UK, he could get on to anybody in the scientific establishment in order to secure small supplies of important materials so that a particular piece of research could be carried on, equipment was obtained, and above all, books and periodicals produced in the UK in absolutely all subjects were made available through the British Council. And I went out as a biological assistant to Joseph Needham, and I was expected to go around not just university departments, but also research institutes connected with the various aspects of the applied sciences. And before that, I had a period in the UK going around places like the Dairy Research Institute in Reading and Rothamsted and horticultural establishments, so as to be able to talk moderately knowingly about what we were doing. And this is unknown to me. The first person that I met when I arrived in Chongqing, indeed on the second night of my being there, was the then councillor at the Netherlands embassy, Robert van Hulik, and he had known of my musical interests, and he had invited various Chinese musicians, and I was plunged in immediately. And the next day I was taken by Joseph to a bookshop, and I found a very important introduction to playing the Chinese zither, book published about 1850, and so that was a sign of what was about to happen. And very shortly in Chongqing, I was introduced to another old man who made this instrument, the Chinese 7-string zither, and I acquired one of his instruments. The making of this instrument is one of the respectable manual tasks that a Chinese gentleman could undertake. He could also practice his calligraphy, of course, every day. He could carve seals, he could paint pictures, and he could grow orchids. And this old man did all these things. And this is in fact a zither of this type, but not the one that he made. This is a much older instrument, an 18th century instrument, and this particular one made in China. And it is probably an instrument derived from the archetypal tube zithers of East Asia, made from either a whole tube of bamboo or half a tube of bamboo, originally with strings that were simply pieces of the cortex of the bamboo lifted up with a knife blade. But these, of course, are silk strings made in a very precise way, twisted from a number of primary strands of silk taken from the cocoon after cleaning. And the really extraordinary thing about this instrument, as compared with all other instruments in the world, is this marking with these studs. In this case, these are mother of pearl studs, but on more glorious instruments they may be made of gold or silver. And these are the harmonic nodes. Of course, these strings are all slack now, and they're not at proper pitches, but that gives some idea of the sound. One needs a bit more nail than I have at present in order to produce the proper note, because you should have the string sliding over the tip of the finger and then engaging, so I'm deliberately having to pluck with the tiny bit of nail that I have. But just to show you, you see there is the harmonic corresponding to the half length of the string, and these nodes mark, these roundels of mother of pearl mark the position of all the harmonic nodes up to the 8th, except for the 7th. The fact that I can't produce a good sound note makes a difference to the quality. And we know that these harmonic notes have been marked at least since the end of the 3rd century AD, and they were probably known long before, because if you have a long string under tension, it's a very natural observation to discover that you can produce the harmonics. And the Chinese make marvelous use of these in compositions for this instrument. The first pieces for it were published at the very beginning of the 13th century, and we have a whole book of tablatures from 1425. Tablatures, of course, meaning that you're told where to put your finger, on which string, how to pluck it, and all the rest of it, but not what the actual note is that's going to come out. Should we hear a little bit of a performer now? This is not the old man I told you of who painted orchids, but this is Mr. Jia Fuxi, who was, I think at that time, probably the best performer in China, certainly the best performer in the part of China unoccupied by the Japanese. And he plays with great musicality, obviously thinking about the music that he's playing in a quite unusual way, possibly because people tend to learn by rote. Sometimes the playing of the instrument is very mechanical, but Mr. Jia was always obviously feeling what he was playing about. And this piece, that we're going to hear some of, began life in the Sung dynasty, say 10th, 11th century, and has certainly grown over the centuries by the interpolation of what one might call glosses, extra little bits of embellishment that various performers have added at the end of their long life to their own performance of the piece, so that it's grown in length. And so the versions that were written down in the 19th century are very substantially longer than the version that occurs in the handbook of 1425. It is a programmatic piece, but all Chinese instrumental music is programmatic. It always has a non-musical reference. And the reference here is to a landscape in southeastern China, the landscape of the rivers Xiao and Xiang, and it's called Mist Grain on the rivers Xiao and Xiang. And the original version in 1425 has descriptive titles for every one of the 9 or 10 sections of which the piece is made up. It's rather like the situation with the Debussy preludes, only Debussy puts his title at the end of the piece, but the title is put at the beginning here. And it starts with a prelude entirely in harmonics. And we'll listen to the prelude, and then we'll listen to the beginning of the first statement of the main body of thematic material, where he goes over from registration in harmonics to registration on the open strings. And that prelude in harmonics in the 1425 edition has the title Smoke Rain on Dongting Lake. Smoke rain merely means mist, admittedly, but smoke rain is such a beautiful term that I retain it. And as I say, I acquired a 17 zither. Its name is qin, and it's usually referred to as gu qin, the old qin. Qin being a general term for stringed instruments, made by my orchid-growing friend, Mr. Xu Yanbai. And I acquired a pupil of his as a teacher, and to my great shame, I've forgotten what the name of my teacher was. It sounds incredible and unspeakable, but this has happened, I'm afraid, with time. I remember once feeling utterly saddened when he sang to me the beginning of "Oh Rosemary, I Love You," thinking that this was an example of high Western musical culture. I felt the difficulties of communication really were pretty terrifying. The 17th zither, of course, has always been very much an elitist instrument, to use a term that was unknown in those days. That's to say, it was the province of the scholar gentry only, the people who had achieved a position by passing civil service examinations, who had benefited by the very best kind of traditional Chinese education that anybody could have. And although in theory, of course, the civil service was open to anybody in China from the beginning of the Christian era, in fact, it was only those who were able to receive a very good education who would be able to carry out the rather extraordinary literary tasks that were required in the course of these examinations. And the whole world of this music was vastly removed from any other sort of music in China. The fact that all the pieces were written down was almost unique in the field of Chinese music. It wasn't until the 19th century, for example, that any lute scores in China were available to ordinary people. And yet the 17th zither had printed tablatures of pieces from the 15th century onwards. And of course you had to be literate in order to be able to read them. The tablatures were only used during the process of instruction by a teacher, and in theory you couldn't ever play a piece that you hadn't obtained directly from your teacher, who in turn had obtained it from his teacher. I don't think Chinese ever permitted themselves the arrogance of trying to interpret a tablature that they'd never heard played by their teacher. While I was in China, I went to Chengdu, which was the provincial capital of Sichuan. Chongqing, of course, was important as a port on the Yangtze River, but was only the wartime capital. The real provincial capital, the old city, was Chengdu. And knowing that I was going there and that I was likely to meet a very famous performer on qin and a very famous owner of important historical instruments, Mr. Pei Tiexia, Robert von Hülich asked me to take with me a copy that he had written of the tablature of a very famous piece in the Qin repertory, Zhuangzi, Dreaming of Being a Butterfly, to ask Mr. Pei if he would graciously supply rhythmic note annotations to the score that otherwise had no rhythmic elements in it at all, because this was what you had to get from your teacher and what it was difficult to supply by yourself, because the Qin scores on the whole have no indications of duration at all. So I went to Chengdu, and in due course I met Mr. Pei, and I was privileged to play one of his dated 8th century Tang 7-string zithers. Poor man, he was hounded by the communists, and he committed suicide, and his 2 Tang instruments were burned with him. I met, about a year ago, his grandson and his wife and 2 children. Some of the family had managed to get to the United States, but I was the only living link with the grandfather, and the family in the United States had never heard the 7-string zither played. Most extraordinary situation in which to find myself. It made all the sadder for me because Mr. Pei had invited me to go and be his disciple, having heard me play. I played Puanzhou, the mantra of monk Pu, on the 8th century instrument. And although I'd never touched it before, it was easier to play than the instrument to which I was accustomed. And the harmonics rang out like little bells in the most miraculous way, and they were exactly where they should be on the strings. It really was the most extraordinary musical experience. And the surface of it was covered with very fine cracks. Von Hülich, in his book on the Qin, says that these only developed when an instrument is something like 1,000 years old. But the astonishing thing was that though you could see these everywhere, you simply couldn't feel them at all with the fingers. Now in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, I've been shown instruments that are claimed to be tongue instruments. I've never seen one with a lacquer patina like this instrument had. And I'm quite sure that Mr. Pei's instrument really was a tongue instrument. It was also inscribed on the inside in a position impossible to get at without demounting the instrument altogether. I left with Mr. Pei the manuscript tablature prepared by Robert von Hülich, and after several months it came to me by post in Chongqing, with Mr. Pei's regrets that never having learned this piece from his teacher, he was unable to offer any suggestion as to how it should be revised. So these are my grounds for saying that Chinese never permitted themselves the arrogance of deciding what the rhythm should be in the absence of teaching. My daily music in Chongqing, after I'd acquired my zither, was practice with the zither, and one uses the tablature only for learning the piece. One never plays from tablature. One may turn to the tablature if one becomes uncertain how a particular passage should be performed, but otherwise one doesn't use the tablature at all. And I found it entirely satisfying as music, and it had an enormously beneficial effect on my musical hearing. It was the first time ever that I'd really thought about the harmonic composition of single sounds. And of course my the pitch sense also was enormously improved by this. So it really has contributed greatly to my musical development. I didn't attempt to play any other instrument while I was in China, but of course I heard other instruments, and particularly the very characteristic Chinese fiddles that come in an enormous variety, but all essentially of this structure. And as you can see, the extraordinary thing is that the bow passes between the two strings, and by rotating either the instrument or the bow itself, they transfer from string to string. The strings are always tuned a fifth apart. You may get fiddles with the four strings instead of two to get a greater sound, and you get fiddles in which the table here is of wood instead of snakeskin. I think this is a python, and you get again very much more sound from the wooden ones. The bowing is underhand, and the whole thing, as you see, is very reminiscent of viol, treble viol posture in playing, always supported on the knee with the performer sitting in this way, and the string tension controlled by the fingers. So, and the resonator is simply a tube, and presumably this is also was originally a tube of a large diameter bamboo. And it is a spike fiddle with the string carrier going through the body and emerging just below. And the strings are slung around this projection below. The bridge, as you can see, is tiny. What is very interesting, to me at any rate, is that these Chinese bridges so often are reminiscent of the tiny bridges for lyres, and particularly of the lyres that turn up in Europe in, say, 9th to 11th century, that sort of period. Really quite remarkably similar, different, of a different overall size, but their construction is extraordinarily like these. And the scroll here, this is a formalized bat, and it is an auspicious symbol because the word for bat is fu, and fu also means riches. So that element of decoration has a good significance as well. And the performers on these instruments achieve absolutely virtuoso skill. When a former pupil of mine, Dr. Carole, was doing his lecture in the Department of Musicology in Munich, which all candidates had to do, he chose to talk about this fiddle and its repertory. And the audience absolutely declined to believe that the recordings he played were played by Chinese and were played on such instruments as this. They said, we all know these instruments are hopelessly primitive, and it is inconceivable that Chinese should ever play with this, showing this degree of technique. And altogether it was thumbs down for him. The Chinese, if they were indeed Chinese who played, had obviously received European instruction. And one of the things that all performers on this fiddle play, it has a number of names, by the way. The commonest name is Erhu, which may be a reflection of the name Duta, two strings, which of course you get in Central Asia. The is two, Hu is here a word for a barbarian in general, but more particularly of people from the Iranian area. Hu Qin, that is to say the barbarian. Qin is another name for it, and there are quite a number of other names. And as I mentioned, they occur in a wide range of sizes. Nowadays, of course, the Chinese, experimenting furiously all the time, have turned them into cello and even double bass size instruments as well. But there are standard ones that are used in opera, particularly in the so-called Peking opera. They have special forms, all with very beautiful and varied tone color. And there's one piece that that fiddlers constantly play with a title something like Listening to Birds in the Mountains. Lovely pentatonic tune that recurs rondo-like throughout the piece, and intermittently they would do bird imitations with great virtuosity. The only other musical encounter, in a sense, that I had in China was when I visited the private museum of an elderly gentleman in Chengdu. And this whole unit that I show you is a marvelous example of Chinese consideration, anticipation of the coming of a guest. When I got to the museum, this was all prepared, this little brocade-covered box which has faded with time, gold speckled paper on the inside. This was originally imperial yellow silk lining it, and they labelled with my name, asking me to graciously keep it, saying that it's given by Mr. Huang Xicheng, and saying what it is, that they are these curious little instruments called xun. These are children's toys, not ritual instruments, but these instruments were used in grown-up size, so to speak, in the Confucian ritual orchestra. They are mentioned in the Book of Odes, the Book of Songs, and in the box along with these two, well, there was a little label, gold speckled paper, beautifully written hand, defining the xun in terms of quotations from the Book of Songs and earlier classics, two different quotations from the Book of Songs. All this prepared for the visit of a foreign devil who happened to be known to be interested in music. And these little objects are historically interesting. This one is a very typical iron oxide tongue glaze, such as you will see on the well-known tongue horses, for example. It's a sort of owl-shaped demon, the eye holes being finger holes, and this one is, of course, a sort of proto-celadon glaze. Again, a quasi-human mask, rather devilish, with little horns growing at the top, and two eye holes for finger holes. Now, Roger blows these much better than I do and gets a beautiful note from them. So, Roger, have a go. It's masterly. Can you generate the three notes just steadily, one by one? was lovely. And so these I brought back home in 1945, Christmas 1945. I got back to Cambridge from China, and after the war, we were fortunate enough to have in Cambridge, as a result of the great expansion of teaching in Oriental Studies that occurred as a result of the war, when Eden discovered that there were scarcely two people in England who could really translate a Chinese or Japanese letter. And as a result of this, they decided to develop departments of Oriental Studies regardless of any students wishing to take the courses. You can imagine the consequences of this suggestion being made in Oxford and Cambridge. The fact that anything occurred in Cambridge was really due to Gustav Hallan, the professor of Chinese. He was a refugee from Nazi Germany. He was a Sudeten German. He had been head of the Sinologisches Institute in Göttingen, and it was there that Arthur Whaley went to take advantage of Hallan's marvelous library when he was working on his own translation of the Book of Songs. And it was as a result of Whaley's interest that Hallan was invited to Cambridge. And as I say, it was really because of Hallan's efforts that the Cambridge department was built up as it was. But we had a lecturer in Chinese art and archaeology, and that was Professor Zheng Dekun from the West China Museum also in Chengdu, and I met him and his wife when I was there. And years later, seeing my Shun from this well-known site in Chengdu, Professor Zheng Dekun gave me this beautiful bird-shaped whistle, rather partridge-like little creature, which is also a rattle, and has little feet, you see. It's got a little wooden stand so that it will stand up, and again 2 finger holes, 3 finger holes, 3 holes, 1 a blowhole and 2 finger holes, so that the bird is held in this position. After I got back to Cambridge in the December of 1945, I was pretty busy as a zoologist for some while, and then Edward Dent, Professor Edward Dent, and Egon Velis asked me to be responsible for chapters on Chinese and Far Eastern music in the first volume of the new Oxford History of Music that was being planned. And this, of course, led to my undertaking a great deal of reading in those fields, and also of listening, because even at that stage there was a small amount of recorded music from many areas in East Asia. When I realized that I would probably never get back to China, I was led to consider the possibility of going to Turkey. I had a friend then, who's dead now, Philip Olliott. At that time he was a fellow of Peterhouse. He had been fellow of Trinity. He had been director of the Freshwater Biological Association's laboratory on Windermere. And in Peterhouse he was Director of Studies in Natural Sciences, but he suddenly decided to throw it all up and went to live in Yugoslavia. This was, in fact, I'm getting my dates mixed up, this was before the war. In Yugoslavia, when it was likely that the Germans or the Italians would overrun the little village on the Adriatic where he lived, he converted all his capital into gold and went to Turkey. And he was appointed as a professor in biological sciences in Robert College in Istanbul. This was originally a missionary foundation, but had turned into a mixed college, that is a mixed government, mixed staff, American and Turkish, with a conspicuously good engineering section. It is now an independent Turkish university. And he invited me to go and visit him during a long vacation. And it occurred to me that in view of what is quite clear from Chinese historical accounts of instruments and musics, that an enormous amount had come to China from Western Asia, that is to say from Central Asia in relation to China, from the West rather than from Western Asia. It might be worthwhile taking a closer look at the musics from which some element might have been derived that eventually reached China. Expressed in that way, it sounds a fairly fatuous point of view. But we know that a very high proportion of the musical instruments used by the Chinese today, in fact, has come to them from Central Asia. In fact, indeed, almost the only instruments today that were originally Chinese are the 7-string zither, another zither that I've said nothing about, a 13-string zither with movable bridges, the little vessel flutes, the xun, of which you saw toy examples, and the free reed mouth organ. So 4 instruments that are antique in China. But the instruments that one usually thinks of as Chinese instruments, the lutes, the fiddle, the flutes, the reed pipes, are all of Central Asian origin. The fiddle indeed probably came to the Chinese from a Turkic people, the Xianbi, and it is almost certain that this type of fiddle originated in Central Asia, and indeed that all bowed instruments originated there, and they are intimately connected with horses and horse culture, and of course the horse hair was used not merely for the bow but for the strings as well at a certain period. And so when I had this invitation to go to Istanbul, I was very interested to hear what Turkish music would be like. The instrumentarium of the Turks in Western Turkey, and of course among Central Asian Turks, is so close to what the Chinese now regard as their characteristic instrumentarium from many points of view, with lutes and bowed instruments, the flutes, the reed pipes. And first I began to listen to what one may call classical Turkish music, the music that is written down. It wasn't written down in staff notation until the 19th century, but there's quite a large body of this music, cyclical forms, suites of various kinds, and I began to have lessons on the kanun, which is a trapezoidal shaped psaltery with courses of 3 strings to a course. One plays on open strings using plectra attached to the 4 fingers of each hand. And I had lessons. I used to take my kanun on a steamer on the Bosphorus and travel from an island in the Sea of Marmara, where I was a guest in the home of the late Sveti Okya, who had at Ataturk's request instituted an opposition, a parliamentary opposition, because Ataturk thought it would be good for the Turks to have some sort of dual parliamentary system. The only result of that was that poor Fethi Bey was almost murdered by the peasants, who really didn't understand this idea of an opposition at all. He was dead by the time I stayed in that house, but his wife, Galibehan, was still alive, and she was the first woman who had ever entertained foreign diplomats at her own table. I used to take my kanun in a pillowcase, board a steamer, and travel to Istanbul from Büyükada, the large island. In the old days it was called Principe. Büyükada to Istanbul, and then get another steamer to go up to Kireçburnu, where my kanun teacher lived in a beautiful old-style Turkish house. I never saw the ladies of the household, but of course they were enormously intrigued at the coming of a foreigner, and I used to be fed the most delectable sweetmeats throughout my kanun lesson. And my teacher started me off simply playing arpeggios on the kanun. It's very important to strike with equal force with the plectra of either hand, so that it is impossible to tell which hand is playing a note. So one has to have absolute equal touch in the two hands. He tuned my instrument, and rather surprisingly, he always tuned to charga, which is the major scale. This is quite a frequent mode in Iran, but in Turkey it simply doesn't exist as a mode for a piece at all. But nevertheless, the Turks use this as their basic series from which to move into other tunings for other more commonly used Turkish modes. I only mention this because there was a moment in his tuning when suddenly one is absolutely ravished by the euphony. I can't use any other term to describe it. A feeling of such perfection in the beauty of the triads, presumably occasioned by the by the perfection of the fifths and the precise value given to the major third. One is simply to hear him playing up and down the major scale and arpeggio, as it were, C major arpeggios, was utter bliss. I never achieved that sort of tuning myself. And one day he put in front of me, I was started off improvising. You see, he would tune to a particular mode, Hijaz, for example, and would say, play. And so I would play. And then he would say, no, you can't stop there. If you stop there, you're in Humayun, instead of being in Hijaz proper. You see, and so I learned really just what it is that makes mode function as mode in this musical world. And this was one of the things that I had very much wanted to discover, what really is the nature of musical thinking in a culture where modality is still of primary importance, and where to be able to improvise in a mode is a sine qua non if you're going to be any use as a musician at all, accompanying a singer. If a singer is going to sing a song, you've got to present the mode in a brief prelude before the singer begins to sing. So this was enormously valuable from my point of view. I learned more about the nature of mode in those few weeks than I'd ever been able to get out of any description of any edition of Groves. And all the modal functions, of course, these extraordinary names like mediant and dominant, subdominant and so on, they all begin to acquire meaning as functional points in a system when you're actually trying to improvise in a given mode. And after I'd done this for some time, he put in front of me the printed notation of a peshref. A peshref is a sort of overture. It was the first movement in the suite, the instrumental suite, the fasl, which is the instrumental form in classical Turkish music. And of course, being able to sight read, I played on and on and on. And he never really recovered from this shattering experience of seeing how a Westerner would make use of notation. It was something obviously that had never occurred to him before. But after that, of course, I romped away on that particular peshref at any rate. And so that was the introduction really to classical Turkish music, and of course I was listening to lots on the radio and going to concerts and so on. And then Philip Alliot was engaged by the sort of Ministry of Agriculture to travel around Turkey looking for suitable sites for marine biological stations, primarily, of course, to keep an eye on fisheries possibilities. And we went to what used to be called Trebizond, on the eastern Black Sea coast, not so very far away from the border with the Soviet Union. And it was sitting in a garden, having a meal in the dusk on the hillside above Trabzon, that I suddenly heard, coming out of a loudspeaker, the astonishing sound of the Black Sea fiddle. And it was really the Black Sea fiddle that decided me that I got to do something about Turkish music, Turkish folk music. We'll hear it in a moment. It is a musical world totally removed from the world of classical Turkish music. Classical Turkish music is the purest possible linear music that ever was. In ensemble, only the mildest sort of heterophonic texture in different octaves, and the perfection of concentration on perfection of intonation, concentration on the purity of realization of the modal series. This is really a sort of primary aim of the classical music, whereas a great deal of Turkish music is polyphonic in a sense, with the use of complex drones. This is true of the long-necked lutes, an enormous variety of techniques of performance, but all resulting in really quite an elaborately textured music. And the fiddle playing itself, largely in parallel fourths with upper or lower drones, sometimes with all three strings playing in continuous parallels. A most extraordinary and at that time to me entirely new kind of harmonic texture. Whether any medieval musicians ever played the fiddle in this sort of faubourn style, I have no idea at all. But it was immensely exciting to hear this music, and I want you to hear a specimen. But before we do that, I'd like you to hear a specimen of the pure classical style of fiddle playing. This is played on a fiddle with three strings that looks very much like a tiny treble viol. It's unfretted, of course, and the strings, the top string is used as a melody string. The other strings are touched only occasionally. And the peculiar thing about it is that the string is stopped with the fingernail, not with the flesh of the fingertip. And this gives a very characteristic color to the string tone. This fiddle, it's known as the fussel kemençesi. That is, the kemençe simply means a little fiddle. The kemençe that plays in the fussel. The fussel is this type of instrumental suite that may well have grown out of the naubat, the representation bands of dignitaries all the way across from Central Asia to Muslim India, on into Iran, and so into Turkey. But sadly, nowadays, the kemençe has been displaced by the violin. It's just the history of the viols and the violins again. The kemençe is allowed to play in ensemble, but if an improvised prelude on a bowed treble instrument is required, it is the violin that plays it and not the kemençe. The kemençe sits there mute while the violin does what it ought to be doing. Perhaps we could hear some of this fussel kemençesi. That is a small prelude improvised by the Kemenche player to introduce a singer who's going to sing an art song in the same mode. I think the next item on the table is a specimen of the Black Sea Fiddler.
Bicoğlu Osman tarafından Trabzon Sık Sarıoğlu'nun havası.
That, of course, is taken from a gramophone record by the man who announces himself, Picoğlu Osman. Osman, the bastard son. He was, in his day, one of the finest performers on the instrument on the Black Sea coast. Such people are often picked up by the folk music group in the radio station in Ankara, for example. They, of course, lose their distinctive style to some extent in that environment, and they're often employed to play in a mixed ensemble such as would never occur on the Black Sea coast at all. I met the fiddler who was in the folklore group in Ankara. This would be in 1960 or 61 when I went back to Turkey, and he was quite accustomed to playing in their mixed folk ensembles, playing Turkish folk songs from anywhere, arranging them according to Black Sea style up to a point, but of course he was inaudible in that ensemble, and he was only really required to play solo, which would be the natural thing for him to do.